Am I off the top of the screen? I'm still off the top of the screen. Hello. Testing. Perfect.
4 people watching.
Fantastic. Hello and welcome to the New Athens live stream. We have in the studio Dan Kulupski, historian, graduate of the LSE, trainee lawyer, theorist of geopolitics and writing on Mackinder at the moment. I'm Lorenzo Mefsut, founder of the New Athens. Welcome to the Four Horsemen of the Tripocalypse, an examination together with our friends at Mornington Media of where we are geopolitically today in a time of pandemic. Are we in good times? Are we in the end times? We're going to be discussing these topics tonight. And in the first instance, I'd like to present you with an image. Oliver, I think in the WhatsApp there is an image, or it's called Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So we've all been subject to this. Here we go. Perfect. We've all been subject to this lockdown for a while, and we a lot of time for reading, a lot of time for research, a lot of time for contemplation. And I've been trying, and we've been trying here at the New Athens to theorize, to strategize, to understand some of the concerns facing our world today. And we've come up with a paradigm. Here is Kuznetsov's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. You can see we have first pestilence, second war, third famine, fourth death. These are the harbingers of the apocalypse in the last book of the Bible, the book of the Revelation of John. And we can see here 19th century Russian depiction of it. Now, it's occurred to us that our current set of concerns, of issues in the world, kind of fall under these four headers of these Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The first one being pestilence, the white horse, which is the king, as you saw. That's, as we can see, representing this plague that's come upon us from China. Is it a pandemic? Then how do we survive it? How do we return to normality with our civilization? These are important questions that we've all been facing in the past few weeks. Our second horse is war. And the war is the red horse, war with China, settling scores. And we're going to examine the Thucydides trap, which is Harvard's way of looking at these geopolitical issues which are facing us at the moment. Then our third horse, the black horse, is famine. We've seen a lot of disruption, potential, actual, of food supplies, industrial supplies, manufacturing, global trade in this current environment. If that breaks down, there will be famine. And so that's another bucket that we can look at the problems we face under. And then for the pale horse, that's death. Are we facing the end of Western civilization? Is there a police state coup going on? Are the Chinese instituting a social credit system globally in the West? Is this a point of decline and fall? or is it a point of renewal? These are the questions which face us today. They're important. They impact all our lives. We're not talking about them in the public square. There is no public square right now. And so here at the New Athens, it's our ambition to curate with you, with the public, some kind of debate about these important issues which are facing us today. I'd like to reintroduce Dan Kulupski, our analyst and friend of the New Athens. He's been writing about geopolitics during this lockdown period, and we've been discussing it in detail, exactly kind of some of the consequences of what we're seeing today, and whether it comes from a longer history of the 20th century, stretching back to 1930, the Great Depression, which we can see certain echoes of that today, and then we can move on through to Bretton Woods and the opening up of China in 1971 between Kissinger and Chairman Mao, and that kind of brings us again to 50 years of our global order today, and now we're seeing the consequences of that in the world. Dan, what's been occupying your attention in this period with regards to the state of the world?
I think it's interesting to think about trade. So before coronavirus hit, you have Britain leaving the European Union, which was the big news, and the American trade war with China. And the interesting thing was that the Europeans could leverage the UK in trade negotiations, that there's going to be an economic shock if you crash out of the European Union. But that happened anyways without them trying, because of coronavirus. All the trade patterns of all of a sudden froze, and countries are becoming self-sufficient. But the point is that the economy is probably going to have such a hard hit that it doesn't matter if there's a hard Brexit. And it's already a hard Brexit. Right?
Well, the EU has fundamentally collapsed in this period. The solidarity of the EU, the remainder 27 EU member states, has seen a closure of borders inside Europe, the end of the Schengen zone, stockpiling of PPE, ventilators, medical supplies, the shutdown of all movement inside the EU member states, noticeably not externally. And the same is the case with Britain. You know, as we heard in Boris Johnson's speech yesterday, confused as it was, in a month's time, we may be in a position to quarantine all the entry ports of airports in Britain and isolate under 14 days of quarantine all of the people entering Britain. Now, that didn't happen during the lead up to this pandemic, when China was exporting millions to the world. We were in Lisle Street in Chinatown on Chinese New Year. It was teeming, and there was no attempt, whether from travel from China or travel from anywhere else, to quarantine and limit the spread of the disease in this country with the cordon sanitaire. And so now we see that Boris Johnson saying that in some future point, in a month's time, perhaps, we'll be able to have a cordon sanitaire at the airport saying, okay, if you come in, you've got to be quarantined 14 days. Of course, what that should be doing is quarantine before the port of entry, before you fly, not in then bringing people to Britain, because that just causes a whole load of logistical issues. But that won't happen. So it's not that joined up. You know, what we've seen is there's been a kind of harking back to Blitz spirit that you've seen in Britain from the government. And it's phony, right? I mean, okay, they've used the rhetoric of war, but the Blitz spirit has been a parody. It's been a form of covering up certain inadequacies of government policy. So if you take C-bills, the government bailing out large businesses under 45 million pounds turnover per year. These have been subject to EU state aid rules because of the EU transition period. So the banks have, and we've got this from good sources, friends of the show, the banks have not been willing to lend money to medium-sized corporations under the CBILS legislation. There's a government loan guarantee because the criteria for the loan guarantee, the banks have realized the government would honor that loan guarantee because the criteria won't be met. So they're not lending to the businesses. The banks aren't lending to the businesses. The businesses are telling the government what's happening. The government's saying, but because Blitz Spirit, the bank should be lending, British banks should be lending to British corporations to save the British economy. But of course, the parameters are, the regulation is that if the banks don't have a government guarantee, because it doesn't work because of EU state aid rules and other rules of the soundness of the loans, it's not going to happen. Similarly, you've seen that in farming. So in Lincolnshire, crops are being rotting on the vine unharvested, and the government then steps in and says, well, we want British people to harvest the crops. Question for the panel. What culpability, from Andrew, what culpability does the Chinese government share for this pandemic? So the best evidence so far, Andrew, has been that the gain of function, in biochemistry, gain of function is taking a disease from the wild, from bats in this case, taking it into the lab, training it on humanized mice and on human cells to become more virulent, and then weaponizing that disease, turning it into a more sophisticated virus which has more opportunity to attack the human biome. So gain of function has, under WMD rules, been banned according to the UN. And so the US DARPA and so on couldn't take viruses into the lab, do gain of function experiments, make them more virulent, make them more attack vectors to the human biome. So they had to farm it out to China. So what happened was that the bat coronavirus scientists from China were invited to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where they had a conference. They started writing papers. They then took the coronavirus samples back, and with American money set up the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where they developed the gain of function disease because they couldn't do it in the West. And then that got out of the lab. Now whether that's intentional or unintentional, when the evidence isn't in, but that's the genesis. So it's American money and Chinese regulation that come together to create this virus in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then it gets out, and then we have the start of this problem. So the administrative state, the deep state, however you want to express it in America, in its long-term interaction with China, has produced this disease as a public-private partnership. So that's a kind of a starting point about our bucket one, our pestilence, our first horseman. As Dan mentioned, trade war with China. How did that begin?
So you're right to say that in some ways it goes back to the 70s. At some point, the United States has decided to financialize. It wasn't a conscious decision, but driven by the general ideals of liberalism and the idea that going back to Adam Smith's competitive advantage, it seemed like a good idea to shift the manufacturing centers into Asia with low cost labor, which would then lead to lower consumer prices for domestic US and Western European consumers. And it would allow Asia to industrialize and subsequently assume that an industrialized Asia would inevitably be a democratic Asia with the development of the middle class. However, the situation has been very different. So what we have is that American industry has been moved to China.
Hollowed out.
Yeah. The American economy has been financialized, where various deregulations that took place throughout the 80s and 90s have made the economy more concentrated in the service sphere.
Yeah.
And what happened is that this neglected the blue collar class of both Western Europe and the United States.
Yeah.
And essentially that's where we got to in 2015. Was it when Trump got elected, or was it 16?
16.
Yeah.
Although he spoke a lot about China on the campaign trail, and so
that was the big that was the big running up. Those are the forces running up to the trade war, that Americans don't have the jobs that they would have had if manufacturing plants didn't move away.
This falls under our third horseman of famine, and our second horseman, to a certain extent, of war. So there's a trade war between America and China, and I think we've got a graph. Here we go. So this is kind of I cribbed this off Eric Weinstein, who showed it on Joe Rogan's podcast. I think it was last week or the week before. And this to him and now to me is the key graph, which describes what happened in the latter half of the 20th century in the West.
This is also just to say Thomas Piketty wrote the big book, Capital in the 21st.
Yeah, I think he cribbed it off Piketty, actually.
Yeah, he's the guy who brought this to our attention.
So what we can see here is, that's great. I love the picture in picture. What we can see here is a comparison over the second half of the 20th century, after the First World War. It starts in 1947. This is a graph about the American economy. And what you can see on the x-axis is time from 1947 to today, or actually to like 2012. And on the y-axis, you can see the comparison between the real GDP per capita and the median male income. So the red line, which the blue line and the red line track together for the first half of the graph, and then they diverge for the second, right? Now, what this describes is the blue line, which heads up, describes if you take the whole pie of the American economy every year and you divide it by whatever it is, 330 million US residents acknowledged in the last census. If you divide the total productivity of the nation by the number of people in the nation, you get the blue line. And for the last, since the Second World War, now the red line represents the average American male worker's income per year. So they track together, which means until 1971 to 1973, this is our key point. This where we see the lines divide is the key moment which explains where we are today. So between the end of the Second World War and 1971, these two lines track together. What does that mean? That means the average worker is contributing and deriving most of the productivity from the real economy. So who is the average worker in this period in America? It's like an auto shop worker in Ford or Chevrolet in Detroit. This is the guy. He's a skilled manual laborer in a highly technical industry, the car industry, in this super city of Detroit in the mid 20th century. So this guy is the standard by which the American pie is divided in this 1947 to 1971 period. Then they diverge. So at that point, the red line, our auto shop worker, he flatlines, and then his real income declines over the last third of the 20th century into the 21st century. But this blue line keeps on going up. Why is that important? Because the pie keeps growing at the same rate it was when it was represented by this auto worker. How did they diverge? Why did they diverge? This is financialization. So instead of real people doing real jobs, making real things, the American economy, as Dan has told us, began to become a service economy, a financial economy, an economy of banks, of Bain capital, of private equity houses, of speculation, and of financial services, of Wall Street. Wall Street became the driver of the American economy, and the auto shop worker left the playing field. So what we can see in this blue line is what's in between these two lines is trading places, is Eddie Murphy trading pork belly futures. It's not about growing the crops. It's about speculating financially on the yield of the profit of the crop at the next harvest for next year, and then creating a derivative financial product which you can then sell on into Wall Street, into the financial markets, and go into a casino setup where you create more multipliers of fake wealth on top of the real economy, and growing in this way. And so this is what we're seeing with this graph. And where has the production gone to create this flat line for the auto worker? The industry which he used to work in has gone to China, and the Rust Belt is created, as Dan has said, in Midwest America, where they used to make things in factories. Now all those factories are in China. After this key moment when the lines diverged, 1971 to 3, what happened at that time? Henry Kissinger and Chairman Mao met in China with Richard Nixon. It was meant to be an opening up of China. Richard Nixon, President of the United States, meeting Chairman Mao, the ruler of China. And actually, the deal was meant to be brokered by Henry Kissinger. In fact, it was a meeting between Kissinger, the representative of what Eisenhower in his 1960 speech warning the Americans about the rise of the military-industrial complex, what we then call the administrative state, what we might call the establishment in Britain, what we might call the deep state in current geopolitical parlance. Kissinger, as a representative of this Western deep state entity, meets with Nixon as a passenger, meets with Chairman Mao, and opens up China. What that means is Western industry goes expatriated across the Pacific to China, and the profits then sit with the corporations working in a public-private partnership with the Chinese Communist Party to create a new trans-Pacific economy, which abandons this auto shop worker of our red line here, and this then financialization leading to, as you can see just at the end of this graph, the blue line just dips, and that's 2008. That's the financial crisis. It's not a big dip in this real GDP per capita, and also the median male income is dipping as well after 2008. So there's another cycle after this. This is just the graph for the 20th and early 21st centuries. where are we going with this? What Eric Weinstein wanted to say with this, and what on Rogan, and what then Elon Musk appearing on Rogan said the other day was something quite reasonable, which is, if you allow yourself as a nation or as a civilization to get into the consciousness of this blue line, permanent growth, based on financialization of assets, then the red line is of making food, making farming, making products, making masks in N95 masks, making PPE, distributing the food and supplies, making ventilators. These are neglected in say the American nation, and then all that industry has been taken off to China. And what we see is then this growth, which is only due to Wall Street. And as Elon Musk said, we can forget with this lockdown, we can forget that there needs to be farming done. We can forget that we can think that the finance will cover us, and then suddenly we didn't make any food this year. And this is where the famine, our third horse, comes in, because we've got so hooked on this international trade system that we're forgetting national interest. Like, can we put food on the table?
We will see a rearrangement of trade patterns because now they have the perfect conditions to do that. The economy has basically tanked. And they're saying that there's 20 million unemployed people in America. So they could, when this pandemic is over, when they're going to start opening up shops, they are going to rebuild it according to their own local understanding. So you're going to see a move away from globalization to localization. So,
spheres of influence, the great game.
Of sorts, I think so. Yeah, I think. Well, Europe has been doing that forever. They've been a protectionist kind of bloc in their own sense, and ironically, the Brexit campaign wanted to go global, go international.
Yes.
Farage talking about being a free trade nation.
Yes. Oh, sort of Singapore on Thames.
Yeah. Because the world is actually quite protectionist. I mean, these World Trade Organizations and other international bodies, they're free trade up to a point. They give you like a bare minimum bearing, but there's a lot of very complicated quotas, visa. So labor mobility is already a good indication of the fact that you don't actually have genuine free trade. An American coming to Europe needs to get a visa. A European going to America needs to get a visa. What you do have is what the graph reinforces is complete free flow of capital.
Yes.
That's what's genuinely free. You can move money around as easily as you want to, and that's not a great thing for people.
No,
they could hide. What Piketty's graph shows is how the tax system has changed. So with the financialization of the economy, people can then say that they are earning, the top 1% are earning incomes from their financial assets. So that goes under capital gains tax, under 10% or 12%, rather than income, which is more closer to 40 or 50 or 60 if you're up there. So they can forward plan their taxes in a way where they can keep benefiting, and that's the real issue. That's the real reason for
where are the profits?
Why the income gap has went like a scissors. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah.
So I mean, you've touched on a really interesting point here, which is, if we look at the C-bills issue, if we look at this notion of, well, actually the shareholders of the bank don't like it if these medium-sized corporations default on their loans. The loans are supposed to be guaranteed by the government. The government criteria won't be met, so the guarantee will fail after the bank delivers the loan to the corporation. The government will say, "Well, I'm not going to back that." The corporation folds and the bank loses its money. Then the officers of the bank, whose only duty is not to be seen to be breaking the criminal law, and is duty one. Duty two, which is more important, let's call it duty two. Duty one is maximizing the profit of the shareholders. That's the only objective. So if you have your auto shop in Detroit, if you have a pottery in Staffordshire, if you make cloth in Wolverhampton, if you build ships on Tyneside, as we saw in the mid-20th century in Britain, a corporate structure, your corporate capitalism is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. As you've said, workers can't move, capital can move. Mm-hmm. And then the profit can be derived as dividend from the company structure. Mm-hmm. The company structure then ties the hands of the officers. So they have to serve the naked profit motive of the shareholders. So even if you have a factory that's perfectly fine in Britain and you could make, your product for 5 times cheaper in China, even though there are cities and families dependent on this factory in Britain or in the Rust Belt, you, the officer of the company, have to close that factory. You have to lay off all the workers. You have to destroy the economy of that city and take the factories to China because the products are cheaper to make there under lower standards, and then you can re-import the product back into the consumer economy. That's where the free trade comes in, as you say. It's free trade. It's socialism for the rich, and shafting for everyone else. What do we see here? The example which makes the most sense in Britain is the last election. Putting Brexit aside, the Labour Party had a once in a lifetime loss of that election since 1935.
Do you think that's because Corbyn is not a genuine opposition figure?
No.
Deep state puts him in there.
No, it's not. It's not the deep state. It's about ease of winning elections. Winning elections, being the tribune of the people, being the advocate of the worker, is hard. The Labour Party was built to serve the interests of the working man in Britain.
But why does he come out and starts talking about free broadband? I mean, is that a priority to a working class family?
Who is it a priority to? It's a priority to a bourgeois bachelor's student in a university town. That's who wants free broadband. You're right. This is a great example of a policy which is irrelevant to the worker in the north of England.
Or at least package up for it to sound more sensical. Like, I'm going to increase the amount of public libraries, which will have access,
of course,
computer labs.
Yeah, decentralized knowledge in a public library with computer terminals.
Rather than saying that we're going to give you free broadband. I mean, I just don't imagine what a state provided internet would look like.
It's not going to be Virgin.
It's not going to be infinite buffering. It wouldn't be inefficient provision of internet.
Vodafone are rolling out 990 megabit broadband cable. Virgin already have 500 megabit broadband. My Virgin Media
5G.
Hub has 650.
Yeah, but in a world where they're introducing 5G,
megabits.
And this guy talks about free broadband.
Yeah,
I mean. And then the Tories just undermine him anyways by saying, oh, we're going to do that, but we're also going to talk about.
But what you've done is you found the perfect example of the problem of the New Left, which is the exchange of a political constituency, the workers of the north of England, who are hard to please, and exchanging them for a southern liberal constituency of bourgeois graduates who can virtue signal about benefiting the worker. So
it became a champagne socialist party.
Yeah, exactly. The New Left, if you look at the New Left, the old left had a critique of capitalism. We want the workers to own the means of production. Yeah. The New Left, we don't want CEOs. We want syndicates, right? The New Left doesn't say that.
You don't want these hidden beneficiaries.
Yeah, the new left doesn't say we want to socialize the means of production. The old left
because
says
they lost the means of
the old
production
left
to China.
yeah, exactly. The old left says we don't want CEOs, we want collectives. The new left says we just want a female CEO. We're fine with the whole corporate structure, with the whole capitalist structure. It's just we want to change the personnel.
Oh, I'll give you a great example. So I was not going to mention his name, but arguing with my friend, and I will give you a hint that he's from the United States, and he accused me of I said I think I'm a liberal. He was like, no, you can't be a liberal. You don't believe in the fact that you have white privilege. You can't be a liberal. So what he's trying to say is that he's a Marxist. You know, because I mean, how is basically kind of like being skeptical about the notion that you have white privilege, right? Is denying you of your liberal ideology. It's not
because the new left is very confused.
Yeah, because liberalism rests on individuality and individual rights, and fundamentally your human rights. By saying that you have white privilege and you need to do some massive affirmative action program, you're denying that the world is made up of individuals, but it's made up of groups and classes. And there's an underprivileged group, which therefore the privileged group needs to subsidize. Or
so to get to really drill down into this point, because I don't think people have really seen why Labour lost this election so badly. The point of the old left was to represent the interests of the worker. And they did technically do that because with the EU, with health and safety regulation, with minimum wage, with increase in worker standards, with increases in product standards for consumers, with increased consumer protections, with increased sick leave and working conditions in factories, and with all kinds of benefits and increases for the life of the work of the worker, the Labour Party did create the regulations where if you had work going on in Britain, it would be to a high standard, not poison anyone, not kill anyone, and give everybody a good wage, and it would be high cost for the consumer, and the consumer would have to tighten their belt and work out, what do I want to buy?
But how about Boris Johnson taking the traditional heartlands of the Labour Party?
Yeah. So what Dominic Cummings
so basically the word Labour Party in an economy which is 70% service orientated, is it becoming a bit defunct? Like, are we go? Because I was frustrated that the Lib Dems didn't become the kingmaker. And they didn't become the kingmaker because they have horrible personalities, which they choose. I mean, in 2010 they did, right? So,
yeah.
But what? So basically, what the Conservatives did is they took what was partly a Lib Dem platform minus Europe. So that would be the big difference, really, is that the Lib Dems' place in Parliament is that they are the party of Europe. Yeah. But they completely lost that election.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives managed to take the platform of everyone else to create some sort of white church.
Yeah. So I'm just sending you a link on the group. It's a video. Can we show video?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So here is, I'll just introduce it, and then if you cue it up. So what this is the real illustration of this defeat by Labour, or it's an end run by Boris Johnson reading a speech by Dominic Cummings on the 24th of June last year. There's like the fourth day of his premiership. After speaking on the steps of Downing Street, he goes immediately on the Saturday, on the Wednesday. On the Saturday, he goes up to Manchester to the Museum of Science and Technology, and he gives a speech in front of Andy Burnham on the right hand side. You won't see him in this picture because the BBC had a different angle, but you'll see Andy Burnham, who's the new Labour Blairite mayor of Manchester. And so what Boris Johnson's speech, which is actually, he plays you'll see him playing a bit of a joke. So he starts speaking, he says, And we are here in Manchester, where over the road in the University of Manchester, we see that Novoselov has just created the first 1 atom thick filament of graphene. We've entered the graphene age here in Manchester. And he's mugging for the camera in a way that Cummings just gave him this speech talking about some science stuff that Cummings is interested in. Boris doesn't know exactly what it is. You can see he's kind of saying, I'm just reading what I'm told. But what he goes on to then say is that the North has been left behind by Westminster, and it's not the North's fault. It's the fault of, as we were saying, the globalized trade system. And so Dominic Cummings then, through Boris, says, we want to give a new deal for the North. And so if we hear it, then we can see why he won that election.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on a Saturday morning, and thank you for joining me here in Manchester, in the heart of the world's first industrial city, a city whose confidence and whose extraordinary future we can see in the changing fabric of the urban landscape around us, the mighty towers of Deansgate Square, last week's extraordinary international festival in Manchester. We can see it in the Christie, the hospital whose cancer treatment is now being written, the future of cancer treatment now being written at the vast new Patterson building with new therapies saving the lives of people around the world for generations to come. And this is not and never has been a city
here we have
for negativity or navel gazing. Indeed, when the University of Manchester's Andrei Geim and Konstantin Novoselov said they were planning to extract a single atom-thick layer of crystallites from bulk graphite, giving us the, I think I've got that right, giving us the super light, super strong wonder that is graphene. I imagine there were people who had no idea what difference it could make to their lives, and I imagine there are people in this audience who frankly have no idea. But we stand today on the cusp of the graphene age, with applications in everything from de-icing of aircraft wings to life-saving medicine. And the story of those pioneers is told here at this Science and Industry Museum, and it is one of the countless tales of Mancunian pioneers, because time and again, when the cynics say something cannot be done, Mancunians find a way to get on and do it. And the centre of Manchester, like the centre of London, is a wonder of the world. But just a few miles away from here, the story is very different. Towns with famous names, proud histories, fine civic buildings, where unfortunately the stereotypical story is, over the last few decades, of long-term decline. Endemic health problems, generational unemployment, downhill areas. And the story has been, for young people growing up there, of hopelessness. Or the hope that one day they'll get out and never come back. And insofar as that story is true, and I'm afraid it sometimes is, the crucial point is it isn't really the fault of the places, and certainly isn't the fault of the people growing up there. They haven't failed. It's we, us, the politicians, who have our politics that an old Labour
candidate
and time and again, they have voted for change, but for too long, politicians have failed to deliver what is needed. And our plan now in this new government that I lead is to unite our country and to level up. And I want to explain now what I mean by that. And I'm absolutely not here to tell you, Mr. Mayor, and others. I'm not here to tell you that London has all the answers, or that everywhere should be like London, or indeed like Manchester.
The pivot he made, which won the election. Now, of course, yesterday he appeared in total confusion. Go to work if you can't not go to work. Work from home if you can work from home. But if you are going to work, don't take public transport unless you have to take public transport, in which case take public transport, and preferably cycle or walk to your place of work which is unlikely in a modern city to be in walking distance, and if you're not a cyclist, not within cycling distance of your home. So yeah, we see two Boris Johnsons. The incoherence of yesterday's announcement on the lockdown policies, and then Dominic Cummings' key thrust, which won the election, which was a New Deal for the North. He goes on to talk about a smart cities program for the North of, is it 3.6 billion pounds for 100 left behind towns? That's the kind of the crux of this speech. But the emotional heart of the speech was this mea culpa, was this saying, it's our problem in the South. We've left the North behind. And the way in which they did that, both the right and the left in this country working together, was to expatriate the manufacturing to China. You can have all the standards of working conditions in the world, the highest standards, but if you don't have any work going on because it's all in China, your workers don't get any of the benefits of having an income, let alone having all these high standards. And that's driven by consumer voters who want or have been told that they want cheap consumer products, and it's been driven by laborers exchanging the hard-to-please workers who need protection. They need protectionism. That is the protection of the economy and the industry that they work in. And that protection has not been offered by the Labour Party. It was offered in that New Deal offering by Dominic Cummings through Boris Johnson's speech in June, and that's why they won the election in December. But of course, you've got your consumer economy. It's cheap stuff from China. Your voters who have a disposable income in the South, who want to virtue signal that they are left-wing in this new left sense, are willing to screw over the northern workers who don't have jobs anymore in exchange for cheap tat from China. And so you've then exchanged the virtue signaling South as your voter base, which in the end it didn't work, because the North moved then to the Dominic Cummings New Deal for the North kind of gambit. That's a consequence of this globalization. It's here, it's now, it's what we are up to, is where we're at. So that brings it home a little from what Dan and I were discussing about China. Andrew asks, also comment on the lack of help provided to Italy by the EU. Dan, what do you make of Italy, EU, and ECB, Merkel?
That's a problem, big problem, because Italy already was at 136% debt to GDP ratio, and I was just reading on the FT that apparently there's no liquidity crisis, in the sense that the ECB is doing the necessary measures for the Italians to keep borrowing, to keep themselves going. But Italy is a tourist economy, right? The world's UNESCO heritage sites are there, and they make a lot of money off people going and visiting these sites and spending money in their restaurants and so on. That's not going to happen for a couple of years, maybe, or 2 years with this lockdown. That's why they're the country which was the hardest hit initially.
They manufacture luxury goods to very high standards, made in Italy.
Apart from the North, Ferrari, the Berettas, they got great stuff. But the reason why they were hit by Corona so strongly is because massive influx of tourism. They have to introduce a congestion charge in Venice because it's impossible to walk there now.
Now there are dolphins in the Grand Canal.
Yeah. So it's,
the water is clear. There's no boats. There's no gondolas. All of these places are the kind of plague-ridden cities that you can read about in
Boccaccio's,
in Decameron, in Camus, La Peste, in who's that guy I really love? Forgotten his name. Go on.
So the point is that Italy's economy is going to drop. It's going to need to spend even more to keep things afloat, just counter-cyclical policies. and it will, just like it did in 2008, it's just going to give further tensions between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. So Eurozone is really going to be put to its test. And if Merkel leaves, which is essentially the consensus candidate in Germany, the single economy, which is in the best position to do all of this, to bail out the rest of Europe, because France also has its problems. It's just been standing in one place for the past couple of years.
Well, I mean, as we've seen, Macron has a Gilets jaunes rebellion on his hands. That's why our logo is yellow, in solidarity with the Gilets jaunes.
It's also quite effective.
It is quite effective, with Mark Reeves' great illustration. Thank you, Mark Reeve, of the Groucho Club and of Spitting Image, who made the Thatcher dolls. And I think he's making some new dolls. We'll get in touch with him.
But essentially, Italy is the biggest problem. But you also do have Spain and Greece, and so we will see what will happen. And what is also is that the whole world is borrowing excessively, America. So maybe you'll see capital flight from Europe, and people deciding to buy dollar-denominated treasury bonds over euro bonds.
Yes, I mean, this whole idea of a corona bond from the ECB, if it's, as you say, bad debt. And again, it's this blitz spirit. It's the idea, well, you should buy it to support this economy. But the capitalist system doesn't allow for national interest, solidarity, any concept other than the maximization of shareholder value. So, you can't even say to your board as the officer of the company, well, like, we want Italy not to collapse because, like, we sell things to Italy, or because we manufacture things there, because everything's got to go. It's a bargain basement fire sale. Everything's got to go, over to China, if at all possible, because of the corporate rules. Because of the corporate rules, they can't have any long-term interest. They've got to have short-term profit interests. I was amazed when I found out exactly how much piracy is involved in corporate in corporate rules. I didn't actually realize that they can't make a pitch to the board saying, hey, let's build up Italy, a 10-year plan. We're going to base ourselves there. We're going to create a town. The town's going to have our factory in it. All the people are going to work in the factory. Then we're going to export around Europe. They can't do that. They've got to go to China. Which, when I found out, was amazing. It robs any long-term potential for a plan, any economic plan, where you can have public-private partnership, where a government can say, hey, apart from maybe Ireland, okay, Ireland's got Google and Facebook and whatever, because big tech companies want the low corporation tax. And so within the EU, Britain, as was framework, Ireland was a place where you had low corporation tax to get into that EU market. So yeah, you can have that particular big tech example does work. But apart from that, it's got to be China. So you can see why the trade war is hotting up. And so that then takes us into this Thucydides trap. So the Harvard Belfer Center, I think I sent you the link.
I am so hungry.
Yeah, the Belfer Center. Send you the link.
The Belfer Center?
So the Harvard Belfer Center is part of the Kennedy School of Government. The Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And they have created a project called the Thucydides trap. Now, Thucydides was the great historian of contemporary historian of ancient Greece. He was reporting, live streaming, if you will, the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. Now, Sparta was, whether it's 300 or with Thermopylae, or whether it's Marathon, Sparta was the the preeminent power in Greece, in a city-state Greek reality of the 5th century BCE. And Sparta was dominant and was fighting with Persia for dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. Then suddenly the new threat becomes Athens, this rising democracy. And of course, we're the new Athens. That's the reason why we're interested in Thucydides. And so this rising democratic power, Athens comes to dominate Greece, create the Delian League of all these city-states coming together in a smart city-states grid of the period. Exactly what we're trying to we're trying to reinstitute now with blockchain and New Athens. And so you have established empire, Sparta, you have rising power, Athens, and they came to war, a war of such attrition that they both wiped one another out over 30 years war, which then led to the collapse of both Athens and Sparta, and Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, coming down from Macedonia, sweeping up all of the city-states into a new Macedonian Greek empire, which Alexander the Great then took to India and to Egypt and so on. Turkey, Asia Minor, all across the Middle East and Europe was then taken over by Alexander the Great, because these two powers, Athens and Sparta, the two city-states, wiped one another out in the Peloponnesian War. This is what Thucydides examines in his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War. Why is it important today? Well, the Harvard Belfer Center at the Kennedy School of Government has looked at this notion of, over the past 500 years, when you've had an existing power confronted by a rising challenger, is there war like in Thucydides? Do they wipe one another out to the detriment of everyone? Our second horse, war. Now we're seeing the established empire is America and the rising power is China. And the question that this center asks, the question that this center asks, and which we ask here tonight, is: will there be war between the established empire of America and the rising power of China? And they go into detail. They over the past 500 years, they identify 16 conflicts of empire versus rising power. 13 of those 16 led to war. And 3 didn't. So if we look at the ones that didn't first, because there are fewer of them, and that's what we want to happen. Firstly, if you go down the page a bit, there's like a list there. So firstly, we have late 15th century Portugal versus Spain. So what happened is, the ruling power was Portugal. As you can see, the rising power was Spain. What happened? Henry the Navigator, Portuguese ruler, sent out colonial explorers, vessels, traders to, whether it's to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, whether it's to China, around the Horn of Africa. Magellan was charting no, that was later. Strike that. Henry the Navigator was expanding Portugal's sea power. Portugal was dominant. Spain was recovering from the Reconquista and Moorish domination of the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal had got there quicker. Now they started to go to sea and conquer the world. Ferdinand and Isabella, rulers of Spain, employed Columbus. He got to the New World. He got to the Caribbean first. Then the Portuguese got to Brazil. And the two powers were facing off in Central and South America as to who would be dominant in the New World. Portugal also had Philippines, Ceylon, China outposts, and was trading in the Indian Ocean. So what happened? The Pope intervened and said, okay, well, Spain can have all the territory west of Brazil, and Portugal can have all the territory east of Brazil, and we'll come to a peace. And there wasn't a war between Portugal and Spain. Then we have to go forward through all of our 16 conflicts to the last two. All of the others, so the first and the last two, didn't lead to war. Then we have the 1940s and 1980s, the United States versus Soviet Union. So this includes Middle East conflict, proxy conflicts between the Soviet Union in Cuba and America, Vietnam, Korea, and so on. And in the end, that Cold War didn't heat up. We had a Cold War. We had no hot war. So here, in the end, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and we saw America winning. Then after that, we see a more localized conflict of 1990s to present, United Kingdom and France versus Germany. So the retooling of the German economy after the unification of Germany, after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a smaller rivalry within Europe, but in the end, everyone was friends, at least until Brexit, where we were still friends, really. Anyway, so there's lots of conflicts in the middle. There's 13 conflicts, which include the Ottoman invasion of Europe, the 30 Years' War, Dutch war with England over the English Channel, France versus Great Britain, Louis XIV, and the 7 Years' War. Then various conflicts. Oh, actually, you missed one. Number 11. Number 11 is our other no war, which is United Kingdom versus United States. So in 1918, after the end of the First World War, America was the rising power and the British Empire was the established empire, and they didn't come to blows. In the end, they collaborated, and Britain sort of withered away and became Airstrip 1, as Orwell would put it, became a satellite of America, or so we're led to believe. So what we can see there is, these guys have taken a deep dive into what are the criteria for conflict to occur or to be or to be averted, and where are we today? Dan has spoken about the trade war heating up between America and China. That's only been compounded now by the coronavirus pandemic, and where do we go from here? Well, China have just moved a navy into the South China Sea. I think we've got. You've been following this. Taiwan is being threatened by China. The WHO is not acknowledging that Taiwan exists. Chinese influence in Ethiopia created Tedros, who is a creature of China, is now the head of the WHO. And China has now bought out the UN structure, the international government structure, which we can see playing out in this coronavirus pandemic. Dan, where do we go from here?
It's an ideal situation because for China, if you want to use military power when the global economy has disintegrated, essentially states have little leverage to sanction each other because those links have already collapsed. It's kind of with Russia when they annexed Crimea. They felt that we can sanction the shit out of them and perhaps we're going to get something. But the Russian economy was in a way prepared to be sheltered from globalization. Not super prepared, but they had enough money to keep themselves going for a couple of years. So with China, the trade war, the fact that they're mutually necessary, that American consumers are needed for Chinese manufacturers, and the American living standards depend on Chinese manufacturers as well. That relationship has been disentangled, so it's more likely that it's going to be more a confrontation of military sorts.
So in 1 week,
or a guerrilla war of sorts.
Well, yeah, proxies.
A proxy, proxy.
Like Vietnam or Korea. So in 1 week in last autumn.
Japan is also militarizing as well.
Yeah, even though it's a pacifist country, it has to.
Well,
in terms
they're
of
amending their constitution.
Yes. In 1 week last autumn, Trump was twice in Texas. Once to greet Tim Apple, as he says, bringing Apple factories back from China, back from Foxconn, to Texas to manufacture Apple products in Texas. And the same week, back in Texas, he came to meet Bernard Arnault, the head of LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moët Hennessy, the big luxury goods conglomerate from France, to open a Louis Vuitton leather goods factory, handbag factory in Texas. So here we have two different industries, big tech, Apple, and LVMH, luxury goods, which are realizing that Trump is building this great wall of tariffs. He is protecting his economy. He is saying, if you want to sell into America, you've got to make it in America, so that we're repatriate. You're not going to put your factories in Mexico, in Canada, or in China. You've got to manufacture in America to sell to Americans. Otherwise, we'll adjust the tariffs so your products are not competitive in the American domestic market. So
I mean, I was in America recently, and you're shocked at how crap the cars are there. So when Americans come to Europe and they see that Mercedes are cabs, they're like, what? How is this possible? Because the protectionist system for the American motor industry has encouraged crap cars.
Yeah.
If the BMWs and Mercedes were at the same price as they are in Europe, a lot of these Chevrolets and Cadillacs would just collapse, and with them would go thousands of American jobs. But there is a minus to this. The Americans drive shitty cars.
Yeah. So I have a story about this. Let's do a story right now. I just sent you in the chat, Dan, Ollie, the LA Times article about Elon Musk and Fremont. So Elon Musk was on Joe Rogan this week. I think it already has 10 million hits, his discussion with Joe Rogan.
Was it the one about AI?
So it started about AI, then they started talking about Tesla a bit, and SpaceX colonizing Mars, Neuralink. Yeah, mostly about the most interesting points about Neuralink. But this was happening at the same time. He didn't talk about China on Joe Rogan, but what he did say, which was interesting, as we mentioned before briefly, was about well, if we don't make anything, if we don't make any food, we're going to starve, and we can't eat money. So we've got to work out what we're actually going to do with America. We've got to get America working again. So he and Joe Rogan were discussing this and the idea of.
But isn't America the largest food producer?
Yeah, I mean, it's America's a breadbasket, and it's actually selling pork to China now. But due to the new first round of Trump's trade agreement with China, pork bellies, pork belly futures back to trading places. Eddie Murphy would be happy. So
basically, what America got the whole national dish of China leveraged.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So if you go to China and there's that's it. Like there's no sweet and sour pork in their restaurants.
Yeah. This is how China are trying to get Huawei back on Google. They're trying to trade. China thought Trump was a paper tiger, in that he has the House of Congress, the Congress, the House of Representatives are against him. There's checks and balances in the American Constitution. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, it's a one-party state. They can get shit done. There's no opposition. So going into this trade war, China thought they had the card of ruthless efficiency in their hand, and that Trump was going to be tied his hands by Nancy Pelosi, by Chuck Schumer, by the Supreme Court nominations, whatever, various internal opposition was going to hobble Trump in the trade war. But by banning Huawei from Google, which has destroyed Huawei's proposition, certainly outside China, nobody buys Huawei phones anymore. Huawei's now having issues with 5G infrastructure in Britain, now finally waking up. to the notion of backdoors. But nevertheless, so what the first shot across China's bows in this trade war was Huawei and Google. So Google is a DARPA-funded company. It's part of the military-industrial complex in America. Trump, the Chinese didn't realize that Trump had the ability to use national interest emergency powers legislation to prevent Huawei from accessing Google Play Store services, Google services, and they didn't anticipate how crushing that would be for the Huawei smartphone proposition. Like the Google services are own, but they tried to create their own iOS, but it hasn't really worked. They got their own place where you can sideload apps into Android, but it doesn't really work properly. So Huawei's mobile phones are dead outside China. Of course, they're inside the Chinese social credit system. Like in China, you have to have a smartphone with attached to your name, to your identity. So one of the notions with the casualties in China was this year, 20 million between this time last year and now, 20 million smartphones have been deregistered in China, which corresponds to 20 million deaths because you can't get rid of your phone. Like that's attached to your WeChat, your Alibaba, your social credit score, whether you can buy a train ticket, whether you can buy a plane ticket, whether you can go in a public place, whether you can participate in the public life, whether now you can travel outside your home because on your phone you have a red, green, blue, traffic light, red, amber, green traffic light system of whether you're passported into antibodies, whether they believe you have coronavirus, whether you're displaying symptoms, or whether you're free to travel. And this is a live update in your phone attached to your personhood. This is how the social credit system with the smartphone is becoming a tool of control in China, like lockdown, more than lockdown we've ever seen here. And that's what is now the objective, is to import that back into the West through the Apple Google coronavirus tracing app, through NHSX on a smaller scale. This is the vector. The coronavirus is the vector for reintroducing this command and control system through the smartphone, through the social credit system, down into the West and to erode civil liberties, the end of civil liberties.
The new space race.
So the space of your mind, the Matrix, the Borg, what do you want to call it? What should we call it? I don't know. So
in a sense, it's similar, because when the Soviets flew into space, the Americans said, shit, we got to be the first ones in the moon. So the concept is that a reinvigoration of the military-industrial complex could...
Yeah, okay, on one side you got
the race for AI, the race for 5G, the race for new technologies. Now, what are some statistics saying that there hasn't been a shuttle to the moon since the end of the Cold War?
There's never been a shuttle to the moon.
So there's a landing on the moon.
Yeah, the Apollo missions ended in like the 70s.
Yeah, so so you're likely going to see a new state-sponsored competition.
Yeah, I mean, tender. So I mean, if you look at DominicCummings.com before all of this chaos, before all of this pandemic chaos, his ambition for Brexit Britain was to coordinate a global permanent lunar base. That was his ambition for what Britain could attempt to do with a reinvigorated sovereign end of globalism, Renaissance, renewed New Deal with the North, manufacturing returns. Tech is we turn Britain into essentially a one nation tech accelerator.
Centralize the Commonwealth as well,
and do moonshot. Yeah, and do moonshot with a that was the goal. Now, of course, that's been entirely disrupted, but that was the kind of the level of ambition that Dominic Cummings had for what Brexit could represent. To tie it all together, I think we're going to be talking about the Four Horsemen of the Tripocalypse for some time. We're going to go back, do more research, get more people on the show, and have more of a phone-in session. But for now, if we go back to the painting, which can kind of bookend where we were at. So the Four Horsemen of the Tripocalypse. We have Pestilence, the King, the Bowman, the Archer on the white horse. We have the Red Horse of War. We have the Black Horse of Famine, and we have the Pale Horse of Death. So the problems we face. What is this? What is this gain of function coronavirus with an HIV delivery system out of the Wuhan lab with American money that has been produced outside of the UN ban on weapons of mass destruction to create a flu virus that also lies low in the body until like HIV, until it suddenly takes you down and kills your lungs. And actually, I have one very important message from a friend of the show who has given us the recipe. So if you or a family member is taken down with coronavirus, what you need is this. You need hydroxychloroquine at 300 milligrams for 5 days. This opens your cells for zinc and other medication to enter the body. Then lazlithinicin, 500 milligrams, 2 a day for 5 days. Zinc sulfate, 220 milligrams, twice a day for 5 days. And azithromycin. Now we need to find out the dosage on that. But essentially the cocktail is these 3 things. Hydroxychloroquine. This is a standard anti-malarial drug which has been available for 70 years, generic. It's not patented. It's not owned by a company. You can get it. Medics can get it. Vets can get it. Secondly, azithromycin, an antibiotic, strong antibiotic. And thirdly, zinc supplement, zinc sulfate, to flush out your cells. Now, that's one treatment that's been promising with regard to coronavirus. The second one is remdesivir. Now, look at, am I pronouncing that right? I can never pronounce that right. Remdesivir. Remdesivir. If we Google remdesivir. So this is a compound manufactured, antiviral compound manufactured by Gilead Sciences. Now, Gilead is the one, if you're investing, is the one company whose stock is rocketing on the New York Stock Exchange. Gilead Sciences, they're making remdesivir. This is a drug which in double-blind controlled trials has demonstrated that it treats coronavirus. That is a pill that says remdesivir. That's how you spell it, remdesivir, manufactured by Gilead Sciences. This is the gold standard. The hydroxychloroquine cocktail with azithromycin, Z-Pak is also known as Z-Pak. Hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc sulfate, zinc supplement, is one treatment option. The second option is remdesivir. Now, on YouTube, people have been taken down. Nurses in America have been taken down for informing the public of what you can do to help your relative in a hospital setting. So you either, if you have a family doctor, if you have another doctor, you can nominate that doctor as your relative's personal doctor, and they can then prescribe these drugs if all the hospital is going to give your family member who you love is high pressure ventilation, which is not the appropriate treatment. Now, in the next episode, we'll be going to detail with testimony from whistleblowers within Bupa in Britain and within Watford General Hospital. And we have hard evidence of medical malpractice and of the mistreatment of coronavirus. What you can do right now, if you or your family member has a problem with coronavirus and they get taken into a hospital setting and they're not being treated with the hydroxychloroquine therapy or with remdesivir, what you do is you tell the doctors in that hospital that they took this medication at home already, that they were already taking this medication. And then you insist as the next of kin, as the patient advocate, your job, if one of your family is ill, is to be their advocate, because otherwise they get standardized care, which is good, but it's not calibrated. And the hospital protocols mean that experiments can't be done on an individual basis. So what you need to do, you need to, even though you can't be there because you're locked out of the hospital, you need to advocate for your family member. And what that means is you either get a second opinion, get another doctor to be their personal doctor, and then they can prescribe in this medication, or you insist that your family member took this already at home and you will need to continue the care. And those are the two methods which informed me by an American nurse who knows the hospital protocol system and knows the ways in which you, as a patient advocate, as a family member, can get the best treatment, get the frontline treatment, rather than the holding pattern, high pressure ventilation treatment. And so that is going to be part of the topic of our next live stream from the bunker by the New Athens, and also looking further into our four horsemen of the Tripocalypse, looking further into geopolitical and economic questions about where we go from here. So with that, thank you to Mornington Media, our hosts. Thank you so much to Dan Kolupski, our associate with a specialization in geopolitics. Mackinder, we're looking forward to Mackinder. We're going to be discussing Mackinder on the next show. And good night from me. We'll see you again. I'm Lorenzo Mefsett, founder of the New Athens. Thank you so much. Stay safe, guys. Cat among them. Pigeons.